Thanks, Jim. Thanks so much for having me. So I'll have some things to say about language and social networks, but actually, I would say that my main take-home message is that in linguistics, we're just starting to use kind of real updated considerations of network structure. And I'll also say that I think that we're not really yet realizing the potential of linguistic insights in like the broader field of kind of networks and culture, you know, how cultural objects arise in networks and travel through networks. All right, so I'm in sociolinguistics, and most of what we do in sociolinguistics is study things we call linguistic variables. And linguistic variables are these abstract objects. They're defined as two or more ways of saying the same thing. So one example you can see in the graph here is just the way of pronouncing the sound A, as in words like say and take and state. And what you see in this graph here on the left is older people in the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, who, by virtue of their age, use a kind of southern dialect. And so they pronounce the sound A like I, like tyke, stite, hi, right? And then as you go to the right on the graph, you get younger and younger people, and they, over time, pronounce the sound in a less southern way, like instead of hi, stite, tyke, they say it more like hey, state, take. And the very, very youngest folks on the far right, especially the women, as you can see, have an even more peripheral, and we say monophthongal vowel, that sounds more like hey, state, take. And so that's a thing that's happening in Raleigh and elsewhere, actually. So that's an example of a linguistic variable. Now, some linguistic variables are relatively structurally simple, and this sound A is a pretty good example of that. Other kind of simple linguistic variables include some lexical variables. That just means the level of the word. So for example, you might say pop, you might say soda. There's nothing very, very complex about the decision there, right? I mean, if you say pop, you're probably from the Midwest. If you say soda, you're probably from somewhere else. Yeah, I guess you could say pop if you're from like the far Pacific Northwest still right now, although I think that's changing. Anyway, some lexical variables are pretty complex. So a good example of that is the word like. So like has undergone what we call functional expansion, and it gets used in all kinds of interesting syntactic ways, but those are well defined, and it's remarkably, like mind-blowingly complex. I can say more about that if you want. Other variables are structurally complex, and a great example of that is copula absence as it occurs in African American English. Copula absence means that you can say a clause without saying a tensed form of the verb be. So like instead of she's gonna go swimming, you could say she gonna go swimming, right? That's copula absence. That is the poster child for a structurally complex variable, which I'll come back to. And the sound ah is also a really complex variable, which I'll come back to. Okay, so that's not the only way of kind of like typologizing linguistic variables. That's just one of the ways, simple and complex. So we have all kinds of sociolinguistic questions about linguistic variables. Two of them are here, and these are very, very broad. How do linguistic variables spread or not between groups? And how do languages change over time? So every living language changes over time, right? So sometimes, not as often as you might think, we use network methods to get at these questions. We usually use ego network data, and our ends are usually really small, and that's because it takes forever to collect and analyze linguistic data. So that's getting faster with better and better automated methods. It's still really, really slow. So to give you an idea, the graph that you see here, that is it's the white speakers from the Raleigh corpus that I've been collecting since 2008, and that is about 200 white speakers, and that is all of them that are just up and running right now. This version of the data finished running on Monday morning. and then I came here. And to collect these data, I or a graduate student had to go and sit with each one of these people. Each circle represents one speaker's mean value, by the way. I'm not really going into what the y-axis represents, but if you know anything about speech signals, that represents the z-scaled second formant, or second amplified harmonic, minus the z-scaled first amplified harmonic of the speech signal produced when people just talk, right? So each speaker's mean value is based on just them saying words with the sound A in casual conversation. So I, or a graduate student, had to go sit with them and record them for an hour or so, usually in their living rooms, you know. And then that all had to be transcribed and, you know, linguistic data extracted and so on and so forth. So our ends are pretty small because, oh, okay. Which one? This?
The room mic.
The room, uh-oh.
Let's try it.
Okay.
Can we hear it now?
Is that better? Uh-oh. Oh, yeah.
Battery's going.
That's right. I'll just try to talk loudly. Okay. No, that's okay. Right. So our ends are very small, often, for good reasons, and you'll see that more and more. The Raleigh corpus that I'll talk about today is actually one of the largest corpora that we have of this type in the country, and as you'll see, it still isn't really big enough for us to answer the kinds of questions I'd like to be able to answer. So here just are a few things that people have said before or concluded or hypothesized about the network correlates of linguistic variation. The big one is actually this one. Having ties to members of another ethnic group or your own ethnic group can promote adoption or retention of ethno-linguistic features. And this one down here, the maintenance of usually stigmatized local linguistic features can occur in dense local networks. And we kind of have this idea that weak ties between groups promote the spread of linguistic innovations. That's never been well tested. We mostly think that that probably happens because we've all read something by Granovetter, right? And we've like heard that he said that one time, and so we go, yeah. But we've never really tested it. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those kind of big two conclusions, just so you can get a sense of like what network research has looked like in linguistics before. So here's one. This was a study done in Philadelphia. It was only about 30 participants, but again, that's pretty normal. And what you have on the x-axis is 4 kind of like distinctive or diagnostic features of African American English, and the y-axis just means you do it more. Then you've got 4 groups of people, and what we find here is that the only people who use high rates of those features of African American English are Black speakers whose alters are mostly Black, right? And then among the other speakers, you can see that the only white speakers who use African American English features at all, really, are the white speakers who have some friends who are Black, right? So this is kind of like an early study, and this is what a lot of them look like. Here's another foundational study. On the left, you see some network data about boys who lived in one apartment building in Harlem, and the numbers that you see are their ages. So these are like pre-adolescent and adolescent boys. The solid lines mean they both named each other as friends. The dotted lines mean that only one of them named the other as friends. And you see that there are a few of them who are in squares instead of circles, and those are the ones that the author Labov considered to be network peripheral. He called them lames, using kind of their own terminology, right? Now on the right, you have data about copula absence. Now remember, copula absence is where you have a clause and it has a tense form of the verb be, like she's swimming, and you omit that tense form of the verb be. So you say she's swimming, right? Now it turns out that that's really, really complicated. When you can do it, when you're more likely to do it, and so forth. And if you look at the 2 lines on the top with the triangles, those are the core members of this Harlem apartment building network using copula absence. And the pattern that they are showing there with respect to the grammatical category that comes after the copula, so on the far left, that means noun phrase like, she's a swimmer. And with respect to the type of subject, whether it's a full noun phrase or just a pronoun, and whether it's singular or plural, is versus are, they're showing the pattern we expect. So those boys know how to do copula absence. They've acquired this kind of complex structure underlying copula absence, and that's the pattern we find time and time and time again in speech communities all over the country, right? Now that itself is really puzzling. That's been called an enigma of uniformity, right? Like how African-American English can maintain such like complex variables across such far-flung communities, right? But what you see on the bottom of the graph there, circled, is that the so-called lames, the peripheral network members, do not know the structural constraints on copula absence, okay? They live in the same apartment building, okay? They've grown up with these other boys. They go to school together, but they somehow have not acquired the structural constraints on copula absence. Now that's really, really puzzling, and that's been taken as an indicator that networks matter for the acquisition of complex linguistic features. Okay, so I'm going to make a big pivot now and shift toward my own work, which does things kind of differently. So as I said, I've been collecting this corpus of linguistic data in Raleigh, and you probably know where Raleigh is. I thought I would just, put that there in case. So we're right next to Raleigh right now. Durham is right next to Raleigh. And Raleigh is in the southern dialect region, the red one. Now, the red isogloss means that people within the red line variably produce ion gliding, which means that for words like high and tide, you can say ha and tad, right? And there's all kinds of structural constraints on that, too. And we can get kind of an overall picture of vowel change in Raleigh. Again, each circle here represents one speaker's mean value, and each of the different colors represents a different phoneme in the vowel system. So for example, this line right here refers to that same sound A in words like hey and state and take. And so you can see here in this line, with the line moving upward, that speakers over time are getting less and less Southern. And this blue line represents ion gliding. So that's, again, words like high and tide and shine, where older speakers talk pretty Southern. They're saying ha and tad and shine. And then the younger you get, the less Southern sounding you are. You sound more like high and tide and shine. Now, the reason for that, one of the reasons, is that Raleigh's been growing. There's been a lot of people coming from outside the South, outside North Carolina, and Research Triangle Park was established here, and that brought a lot of folks like from IBM and all kinds of places from New York and elsewhere to Raleigh. So you got a kind of like dialect mixing situation. Now, in linguistics, we know what happens in that type of setting. What happens is that whatever kind of like stigmatized local dialect is the kind of the most prominent one, that one kind of just gets steamrolled by a more standard like national dialect. So that's exactly what's happening here. And that's kind of why I think it's a perfect setting to look at network effects on language, right? Because like we already know what's going on linguistically. That part of things is not a mystery. What we don't know is by what social mechanisms that happens and by what social mechanisms other linguistic processes happen. We actually have no idea. It's kind of weird. So in Raleigh, one thing that's relevant to all of this, from a network perspective, is that the development has been asymmetric, geographically speaking. So you've got your like older central Raleigh in white, and then you've got growth over time represented by the different colors. And you can see there's been a lot more growth to the north and the south. And the reason for that, one of the reasons for that, is that Research Triangle Park is to the northwest, and other universities are to the northwest, right? I say other universities. NC State is in Raleigh, right? Yeah, sorry. And so one thing I wondered was, okay, great, like we know that the Southern dialect has been in retreat, that's all fine. I wondered if people in North Raleigh, controlling for age and so forth, if people in North Raleigh would actually be less Southern talking than people down in Central Raleigh, right? Because like up in North Raleigh, that's where all the new development is, and you're probably like less embedded in like the older Southern networks and so forth. So that's kind of what I set out to test. And the networks that I'm using are bipartite networks of schools and speakers. So in these graphs, you've got 3 generations of schools and speakers. So the bigger circles, the bigger nodes are schools, and the smaller nodes are speakers. Speakers are colored by these like very broad socio-economic characteristics like white collar and blue collar and a kind of like in-between grounds. Schools are relevant for this question because your vowel system largely calcifies during adolescence, right? So I was interviewing most of these folks like well past high school and so forth, but I still wanted to know where they went to elementary, middle, and high school because that's when their vowel systems formed. And you might think like, oh, but if I move to a new place and I talk to the people in that new place, then my vowel system will change. Well, not as much as you would think. It's really amazing. You would be surprised at how well you retain like early linguistic features or linguistic features of where you were when you were a child and an adolescent. Okay, now so generation 1 here. This is the oldest folks, and what you can see is most of them went to Broughton High School. Which is where you went to high school at that time if you were white for the most part. No one black was allowed to go to Broughton High School at that time. A few of them went to Enloe, which was in the east, but that was a more like working class area. And in fact, you can see that the 2 people who went to Enloe in this generation are blue collar and like sort of quasi blue collar. Okay, and then when you go to generation 2, that's people born between 1950 and 1965. Those are people who were growing up during the first period of language change. They were also the first generation in Raleigh to attend integrated high schools, and the first integrated high school was Enloe. And you can see that there's like a line I'm not supposed to cross here. I know I'm going to cross it. The people who went to Enloe here, you can see there's more of them by this time. That's because a magnet program had started where you didn't have to go to like your base schools anymore, right? You could like go elsewhere in the city. And then the youngest folks in generation 3, they were born 1966 and onward, and they, by that time, you had lots and lots and lots more schools. You had this like well-developed North Raleigh situation, and you had this magnet program encouraging people to leave their neighborhoods for school. All right. So you can see a few indicators of the changing network topography. So in generation 1, you had more speakers than schools in this sample, and then that changes over time. And you can see the average geodesic changes over time. It just climbs and climbs, and then the clustering coefficient also falls. And that all is just kind of stemming from the fact that as we move on in time, we get this well-developed North Raleigh, right, with all of these very new schools and people variously attending magnet schools all over the city. So what I wanted to find out is, first of all, we know that speakers of different ages in Raleigh are going to talk differently, and that's because language change has been happening very fast there. So given that we know linguistic change is happening, are there network differences that kind of like moderate, or I guess I should say mediate, their the linguistic effect of the age difference? And so I did a lot of this work with Richard Benton, as Jim said, and we used 3 big strategies. I want to mention, too, that my goal here was mostly to take what we know, what things we know about language change already, and see what would happen if we applied some kind of like very familiar network strategies to try to find out if we could, to try to find out something about the network mechanisms underlying these very familiar linguistic patterns. That was the goal, right? Okay, so the first strategy that we used was cohesive blocking, and this was definitely the best one for all kinds of reasons. And we used the one-mode projection of the bipartite network, and as you probably know, cohesive blocking involves the identification of hierarchically nested cohesive groups in the overall community network, okay? So I'm not gonna go into that more, but I certainly can if you'd like me to. One of the things that was really important in this project was to make some odd-looking graphs that could help us really understand what was going on in the models. So I'm going to show you a few of those. And so what we have here is on the x-axis, the age difference between pairs of speakers, right? And on the y-axis, the linguistic difference between pairs of speakers. And this graph is about that same sound, A, right? That same phoneme. All right. Now, the colors of those circles indicate depth in the cohesive blocking output. So like the lighter the color, the deeper, the like more nested in the hierarchy two speakers are. So they didn't even have to occur in the same cohesive block. They just had to occur at like the same level of nestedness, which means the same level of embeddedness in the overall Raleigh network. And so what you can see is that the lighter colors here have a shallower slope, which means that the effect of age difference on linguistic difference is weaker for speakers who were mutually embedded at this like deep level of the network. Now, what does that actually mean in this case? Well, it means that if you get two speakers, both from that kind of like older central part of Raleigh, they're going to be more linguistically alike than two speakers who are in different parts of the network, right? So like an older speaker in central Raleigh and a younger speaker in like far-flung North Raleigh are going to be really linguistically different in a way that two speakers of different ages in central Raleigh are not, okay? Now, what that additionally means is that, yes, younger people in like the middle of Raleigh are retaining the Southern vowel system to a greater extent than people of the same age in far-flung North Raleigh, right? If you're wondering, by the way, is that a function of like who your parents are, how your parents talk? No, it's not. I should have said that earlier. That's a thing that we kind of know in linguistics. You know, it's how you talk is mostly not about how your parents talk, right? Like it can be if you're like homeschooled, right? But mostly it's not. It's about your peers, you know, more than you would think. So, okay, great. I appreciate that so many of you are nodding. This is great. You know, I've been worried that I wouldn't explain this well enough at all. So usually I talk to linguists, so this is great. The next thing we tried was what I will call structural equivalence. And it is in the sense that I measured the Jacquard distance, you know, for every dyad in the bipartite network. It's not really structural equivalence because I did not then take that matrix of Jacquard distances and turn them into clusters. You know, like if you saw Jim's presentation on block modeling yesterday, that's a thing you got to do if you're doing block modeling, if you're doing structural equivalence. I didn't do that, and the reason was that I actually wanted this like matrix of network distances like that was kind of like theory neutral, right? Like with the cohesive blocking stuff, we started with a theory. With this, we started with no theory, and that was on purpose, right? Because I just wanted to see what would happen. You know, we had a reviewer say, well, this is not structural equivalence. You shouldn't call it that. And I just said, okay, I'm going to call it that. And I just did, and so here we are. So we did regression, you know, with that matrix of network differences, you know, with the matrix of Jacquard distances as just one of the independent variables, right? And the dependent variable is a matrix of linguistic difference for every individual vowel in the vowel system, right, that I showed on that other plot. And so the question is like, does one influence the other? And what we find is in various ways, yes, but that's always in interaction with other things that we know matter for language, right? Like gender and age and occupation, okay? So for example, if you look at the plot on the right, which again is another instance of a kind of like really messy looking plot that that I'm proud of because it lets me see what I was trying to see. Is what you find out is that the network effect is stronger for women than for men. And that's good because we've been hypothesizing that in sociolinguistics for years. For years and years and years. We didn't know, but we said, I bet network matters more for women than men. Wouldn't it be great to try to find that out? And it turns out, yeah, it does. It's not a very strong effect here, but then again, I was approaching this from a theory-neutral perspective, so, okay, great. We also did community detection with both the one-mode projection and with the bipartite graph. And with the one-mode community detection, I tried all these different methods. A lot of them were kind of sketchy. And the one that worked the best was InfoMap. Now, the most interesting thing about the community detection results is that you can see that some communities maintained this one complex linguistic variable better than others. So we're talking now about the sound ah, and that's in words like bad and ask and bat. All right? Now, I'd just like to invite you, especially if you're a native speaker of English, I'd like to invite you to think about those 3 different words. Say them out loud to yourself if you need to, that'll be fine. And just think, do you say the vowel the same way in those 3 words? Bad, ask, bat. Think about it. Bad. How many of you think, no, I say the vowel differently in those 3 words? Yeah, right. Yes. How many of you aren't sure? And that's fine. Yeah, that's fine too. Good. Okay, I just want you to think about it. Ash, that's what we call that vowel, ash. That is a notoriously complex vowel where the effect of the following segment on how you pronounce the vowel varies a lot from one place to the next. Now, in Raleigh's system, what we expect is that the vowel is more tensed, it's more peripheral in the vowel space. That just means your tongue is higher in fronter when you say it. When the following sound is what we call a voiced stop or a voiced plosive, like in bad, and then it's a little bit less peripheral when the following sound is a voiceless fricative, as in ask, and then last but not least is bat, right, where you've got a voiceless plosive following the vowel. And so what would that sound like in Raleigh? Well, among like the oldest folks, that would sound like modulo various things. Bayad, ask, bat. Okay? Now, if you're from somewhere else in the US, all 3 of those words for you might sound like, I can do this. Bad, ask, bat. Or they might sound like bad, ask, bat. Or if you're really young, bad, ask, bat. So this is a really complex feature, and it's been changing a lot over time. What we find if we take just the 3 largest InfoMap communities, and we kind of like, crunch our numbers, we find out that this module that's really about like central schools is the one that maintains that kind of bad, ask, bat hierarchy the best. It's kind of hard to see on the graph, I think, but it's true. And crucially, the oldest people in that module, who you see this is like excluding the very oldest speakers, the oldest people in this leftmost module here kind of like had that hierarchy to a greater extent from the beginning than the oldest speakers in the other two modules, right? Now the ends are too low in any of the other modules to run this analysis. That's why I said, like, even with like a relatively large corpus by sociolinguistic standards, we still don't really have enough data to do a lot of the stuff that we want. We also ran this two-mode community detection routine called Quanbimo, and that was fine. It generated results that surprised me a bit at times, and I did some like recoding on the basis of ethnographic knowledge and so forth, but I mean, trying to hold true to what Quanbimo told me. One of the things I found out there is, okay, if you compare speakers in this one module that's like this affluent central Raleigh module, you find out that they were less Southern than speakers in like a working class East Raleigh module. And that working class East Raleigh module was also where white flight was happening at the time. And so there's a lot to talk about there. Okay, so those were just like a few of the results that we got from these various kind of explorations with different network methods. But the bigger question, I think, right now is at what scale do networks matter, right? So we've got simple variables and we've got complex variables, and this is something that we haven't even really started asking very much in linguistics, and I think we really need to. So you've got your structurally simple variables, and that graph on the right is the same thing you saw on the first slide. It's just A changing over time. So that's a relatively simple variable. And those are, simple ones are things that can probably spread pretty well via just like weak or elastic ties. I mean, just almost whoever you are in the city, you're gonna, unless you're like super, super peripheral or super isolated in some way, you're gonna take part in a linguistic change like that, right? Like it doesn't really matter what your ego network looks like, I think. I haven't directly tested that yet. Now contrast that with complex linguistic variables like copula absence, right, or like ash. And I think that those are things that do not spread via weak ties. I think like to acquire the complexity of those, because it's not like anyone's teaching you, right? Like at no point in Raleigh does anyone like in school go, okay, everyone, it's bad, ask, bat, right? Like you just have to like acquire that by hearing it over and over and over. I think that you have to be in like some kind of dense homophilous part of the network. I think like this is probably going to be a function of ego network characteristics if we get around to testing that somehow. And I think that we could also be asking questions about how linguistic data, both in terms of simple and complex variables, can be leveraged to build knowledge about just how cultural changes spread through networks. I mean, these are cultural changes. They're like, socially laden. They're socially indexical. And we're not doing that yet. So I think that's another thing to think about. The newest phase of the Raleigh study, which has just started this year, involves ego network data. And I'm looking especially at urban ethnolects. So there's like Latino English, there's African American English, there's African ethnolects, like people from, like whose parents were from Nigeria or Somalia especially. This graph here is the same, it's the same thing as I've been showing you, this stuff about A changing over time, but now you can see not just the white speakers, which is what I was showing you before, but also the black speakers, and there's not as many of those. But what you can see is that the oldest black speakers over on the left never had Southern A. They grew up in Raleigh, but they never had Southern A, and so they're not really exhibiting change over time. Now, how is that possible, right? They have some other Southern features. We don't know. We don't know how it is that copula absence is maintained in African American English so well. We don't know how it is that black speakers and white speakers can exist side by side in a city for centuries and have completely different vowel systems, right? So that's something to look into. And then meanwhile, there's these emerging ethnolects that are big in Raleigh, like Latino English and so forth. So I think there's a lot of potential here to use network methods. Just quickly, I'll tell you, so we're in the pilot phase of this ego network data. Here's what the protocol looks like. We're focused on who ego talks to regularly. Now, the reason we're so interested in that is that we're interested in language, right? We want to know, where is your linguistic exposure coming from? Who are you potentially like aligning with and imitating or disaligning from, in your regular conversations? And here's just a couple of examples. You've got this white male born in 1986. He's actually too old for this study. We're focusing on young people, like 18 to 25. But you can see that he's got these 3 social domains. The color of the node indicates ethnicity. So all of his friends are white. He's got 3 different non-overlapping social domains. And then the person on the right, whose parents are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, she has a very different situation going on, right? She's got, not these like, just 3 components that are defined entirely by social domain. She's got a lot more ethnic heterogeneity in her network. So initially, like when we first started the pilot phase, I thought, great, this is going to be interesting. Like people in this kind of like ethnic enclave that we're targeting right now, we're going to have like, ethnically heterogeneous networks, and that's going to be, and they're going to have all these different social domains, and that's going to be interesting. And I was very wrong about that. Because then you got people like this, whose family members and friends, the only people that she talks to are people of the same ethnic group, and they're pretty much all just her family. I don't think I have time for this, but just to say that one example of a complex linguistic variable that we'll look at in these data is this thing called the pin-pen merger. And kind of at a surface level, all that really means is that you say words that end in en the same way as words that end in in. So instead of pen, pin, you would say pin, pin, right? Okay, and I've already gone over my allotted time, so I will stop there. Okay, thank you.
Questions or comments for Rob? You feel your own comments.
Sure. Yeah.
How would you get at something like code switching where someone speaks differently depending on the person they're in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that will be one component of the ego network study. When people do that, usually what they do is they pick like a few people from a corpus and they say, okay, we're going to get, just for you and you alone, we're going to get data from, you at school and also you with your family and so forth. That's a very time-consuming process, as you might guess. Yeah, and the results are very mixed on that. Very, very mixed. Yeah.
This is super interesting, so thank you for exposing us to this. Do you see similar dynamics with virtual spaces or shared virtual spaces versus in person?
That's a great question. I would say we don't yet know. Some promising work that's happening there is let's see. I'm trying to think about what's the best to talk about here. So there's online data that is not really interactive, right? Where like someone will just post a video, right? And they have this idea of who their audience is, and we kind of draw inferences on the basis of who we think they think their audience is. What kind of like social moves they're taking with their language. I think at this point, there's a very little bit of data about real spoken online interaction, and I would say the conclusions from that are still getting going. Yeah, we'll see. That's a great question. Yeah. Carter?
That's really fascinating stuff. There's a ton of questions that they asked. But one thing, I guess there are two things I'll ask. The first one is, given you talked a bit about status, and I think status is enormously important in this. At least anecdotally, as someone who grew up in the South, and hopefully you can't tell.
Oh, I can tell. I just know that you're mixing it up a lot.
Yeah. Well, see, you have the magic power. But this was certainly a heavily stigmatized accent, and you knew that as a kid, and you could tell among other things from media. So any kind of vaguely high status media was not. No one delivered the radio in a Southern accent.
Yeah.
And you can figure out what that means really easily. So I think figuring out, measuring people's perceived status associated with accents and also associated with individuals might be really, and media might be really helpful in terms of, if you think about people modeling their speech, there is who I interact with, but who I want to sound like and who do I not want to sound like.
Yeah.
People are very aware of that. Collecting data on that would be interesting. And I think with electronic data collection, if people would be doing this out of this area, it would be entirely possible to have people listen to a snippet of someone saying something that's been modified digitally to have a particular accent. You can just say, rate the social status of this person. And you could give them different things. And it would be interesting to see differences in perception. Especially because there's a difference between hierarchical perception and then closeness, right? Maybe I want to sound like certain people because it's a tribal identification. I know that group is higher status, but those are Yankees.
Yeah.
I want to sound like that.
Exactly.
Or,
we've done that. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, we've done that in the lab. I was only talking about the non-laboratory parts of the study here, but yeah, you're exactly right. That kind of perception study, the results of things like that are always really noisy, right? And I think partly for the reason that you just articulated that, okay, yeah, I know that northern sounding speech is higher status, but that doesn't mean I want to sound that way. That doesn't mean, I think that's the best. I like your idea, though, of asking people, the individuals in the study, who do they want to sound like?
right.
There's plenty of data out there about people's perceptions of Southern speech. We know that people think it's friendly sounding, it's warm sounding, it's just uneducated sounding, right? And like conservative or ignorant sounding, right? In general. And amazingly, we know that kids figure that out by the time they're like 10, But you're right, I didn't ask every individual person about that directly, and maybe I should in the new.
So the network, from an egocentric network standpoint, people's perception of not just who am I interacting with, but the relative status of those people linguistically, and then also some sort of social. I could think back to the social distance stuff. That might be relevant as well. So and that might get at some of this tension between. I might have people I see as high status. It might be helpful to be seen that way, but if I don't identify with them, I may not want to create social distance by not sounding like them. And of course, code switching is another way to manage that kind of interaction that people do.
Yeah.
But anyway, the second piece that I wanted to ask about was data collection. So I would think naively that it should be possible to do with mobile devices to do, to automate a lot of data collection, how you pronounce things like that. I don't know if that's something that you guys are doing in the field, but I would think you should be able to use that to scale up some of the stuff if it's not being done.
Which piece of it were you thinking of automating?
As much as possible, but
sure.
Always. But I'm thinking, you can have people speak into the device, right? And I don't know if what the state of the art is on being able to pick out these key sounds from giving it.
The state of the art right now, right now I think that we're just about maximizing our potential in that regard, although I could be wrong. The state of the art right now is that, you capture the voice somehow, however you're doing that, and then you can apply an automated transcriber, right? Now, the automated transcriber, no matter how good it is going to require some human correction. And that is the slowest part by far right now. And then after you've done the human correction, you can automate the alignment of the transcript to the sound file. So matching it up phoneme by phoneme and so forth. And then you can automate formant extraction, right? And then you just have human data cleaning happening after that. I said that human correction of transcription was the slowest part. No, the slowest part is the collection of the actual data, like finding the speakers, getting them recorded, and so forth. But yeah, like we could have them just, mic'd up and going about their business out there instead of being like interviewed by a peer. The only problem with that is that oftentimes when you do that, the data are very, very noisy. And we need kind of pristine data for the automated transcriber to work. So.
I guess I was wondering, like, if you have an app and the app gives me things to say, and I speak into this thing and it's standardized, so everyone's getting the same stimuli.
Oh, I see.
Can you train a learner to then parse out the things you want? I would think it's a machine learning.
Okay, so you're saying like have everyone like read the same thing or say the same? Oh yeah. Okay, right. Some linguistic studies have done that. We definitely don't want to do that because the problem is when people are just told what to say or when they're reading a prompt, they're not really using their everyday pronunciation of things. Yeah, that's the only
switching problem, actually.
Yeah, would be yeah, but some studies have done that. Yeah. Yeah.
I think
One more question about that.
Sorry. I have another question, kind of coming back to the code switching. Are there sorts of biases that are introduced when the person that comes out to interview folks speaks in a different way, perhaps, than other folks? And is that differential by generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. So we've controlled for that as much as possible. So like the field workers that I hired were people who had as close as possible the same dialect as me, right? Like so I'm from Southwest Ohio, so are they, and so on and so forth. That doesn't matter for the older folks nearly as much as it matters for the younger speakers, right? Because the older folks are very secure in their dialect. A lot of them, they're like, screw it all, I'm doing this study, I'm gonna talk the way I talk, But you're right, for the newest phase of the study, the interviewers are only peer community members, right? So like I'm looking at the Somalian kind of ethnic enclave. The interviewer is one of those people, right? Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, and that's been a hard part, yes. That's a good point. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much, Robin.
Yeah.